Hi everyone, this is a continuation of your notes that you took last time on the Civil War. We're going to be looking at how the war is going to hit its peak as well as the ending of the Civil War. So last time we talked about how the Union had a difficult time finding generals that had experience and were good enough to lead the Union to victory. Although they had more men and they had a standing army as well as more supplies in the South, the lack of leadership is going to be a huge problem in the early part of the war. General George B. McClellan is the first of these that is going to be a failure for the U.S. Army. McClellan is going to be taking control of the Union forces in 1861, and he ends up getting the nickname of Tardy George McClellan because he can't ever seem to make a decision on what to do and which strategy to go with. And because of this, he's always kind of waiting to the last moment, and that allows for the South to gather up their forces and to continue to build up as they go into battle and oftentimes win as a result. Next, we have General Ambrose E. Burnside, who was not much better than General George B. McClellan. In fact, really all he's known for is his, as you can see, fantastic facial hair. And he's actually the person that we have to thank for the term of sideburns. So many men liked his facial hair that they began to fashion their facial hair in the same way, and they became known as Burnsides and then eventually sideburns. And that's not what you want your general to be known for. After that, we have General Joseph Hooker, who was in charge of the U.S. Army during 1862 and 1863. And he was having difficulty because the U.S. Army was losing many of their battles due to the previous generals, and morale was extremely low and desertions were high. And he felt that one of the things that could help morale was to give the men what they had not had in a while, which was the attention of women. And so these camp followers that began to follow the Union Army from battlefield to battlefield were quickly named Hooker's Girls, and then eventually became just known as hookers. And that is also something that you don't want your general to be known for. You want them to be known for winning battles instead. And finally, we get General George G. Meade, who takes over in 1864. Now, he's not terrible. He is going to be the general in charge as we fight the Battle of Gettysburg. And that is technically a win. However, it is still a battle that is extremely deadly and is not as strong of a win as we really need in order to turn the tide of the war fully in the favor of the U.S. Army. The technology that comes around during the Civil War is going to be something that truly changes the war itself and is part of the reason why it's so incredibly deadly. What we have up here at the top right is the Gatling gun, and the Gatling gun is kind of the precursor to what we would see as the modern day machine gun. One major difference in that is that it was not automatic. It actually had to be cranked for it to work. And many times, because this was made out of copper or it was made out of iron, is that it would get extremely hot and then it would begin to warp. And when that warps, it doesn't shoot straight. So not only was it inaccurate, but also many times it would jam and explode and kill the person operating it. We also have in this war the very first submarine. It did not actually fully submerge, but it is going to be the beginnings of that technology, which will come to its apex in World War I. We're also going to use hot air balloons for surveillance in this. And so you see an example of a Union one here called the Intrepid. And the hot air balloon was a new technology that would allow for them to see where their enemies were congregating, how many men they had, how much artillery they had at their disposal. And so it was a pretty key piece of espionage at the time. Telegraph and railroads are a huge part of the success of the war itself. Please remember that 3/4 of all of the telegraph lines and railroads are located in the North. And that's going to be beneficial for the North over the South because the North is going to be able to not only transmit messages about the war, but also their supplies and troops much quicker and easier than the South. And finally, we're going to have the creation of ironclad ships. This is probably one of the most significant military changes of this war. The ironclad ships were initially actually older ships that were then literally just having iron kind of put to the sides of them, and then they actually refashioned them into two different styles. So the Monitor and the Merrimac is going to be the most famous battle between the ironclad ships. Although it was a draw, technically neither one of the two ships won. What it showed us was the fact that the bullets and the cannon that would be fired would actually bounce straight off of the ironclad ships, making them harder to sink. And so eventually that would replace all of these types of ships, these old clipper ships that we used to use, that were easier to sink, made of wood, could catch on fire. And this is going to revolutionize and modernize the U.S. Navy. The war rages on and we get to the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest day of the war. It is in a single day. We are going to have 4,000 that are killed in action, roughly about 18,000 who are wounded. And although this is technically a win for the North and it stopped the Confederate march northward, it's not a decisive victory to actually turn the war and turn the tide of the war in favor of the North. And so this is going to also kind of add into the fears of this being an extremely long and bloody war. But the other thing that's kind of significant about Antietam is that it's one of the first major battles to be photographed, as you can see in the image here. These images were all captured by the man you see at the bottom corner, Mathew Brady, and he is known as the Civil War photographer. His images from this war really changed the face of the war. It made it more personal. It was the first time that Americans that did not live near the battlefield had seen the devastation of the war itself. And while you may not necessarily think that you are familiar with Mathew Brady and his work, it's actually something that you've seen many times in your lifetime. Most of you may recognize this image, though you may not be able to place exactly where you've seen it before. But this is one of the earliest daguerreotypes of Abraham Lincoln during his presidency. You probably best recognize it as the image that you see on your $5 bills. As the war raged on, it got harder and harder and harder for both sides to convince individuals to actually join up into the war. The initial fervor for joining the war and fighting for their beliefs started to wane very quickly, especially as the body count began to rise, especially after Antietam itself. The Confederacy did have a draft. They allowed for an exemption for anyone who produced 20 slaves. Obviously, this would then apply only to the aristocratic elite. You could hire a substitute for a relatively high price as well, which meant that the only ones that were able to do so were the wealthy. The United States did something very similar. Lincoln passes the Enrollment Act of 1863, which is the first federal draft law, and you could pay $300 in order to buy a replacement or a substitute, similar to what they had in the Confederacy. Now, this was done so that wealthier families could continue to fund the war without having to worry about their fathers or their sons having to go off to war. And that meant that really only the wealthy could afford to purchase the replacement, meaning that this war was fought by the lower classes. And that is what is going to lead to the New York draft riot. In New York City, immigrants, specifically Irish immigrants and working class men, began to riot over the draft law, realizing that this was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Very quickly, though, this became a racial riot because blacks were also not allowed to register. And so it meant that white men were having to die for black men that were not going to fight for their own freedom. And it was a bloody revolution that happened. Aside from the Civil War itself, it is the largest civilian insurrection in American history, and it raged on for over 3 days before it had to be suppressed by the military who had just returned home from the Battle of Antietam. This frustration over the war and the lack of motivation to enlist is part of the reason why we're going to need a new cause for the North. They're going to have to define their cause more than something that is so intangible, like preserving the Union. It's going to give the North a reason to fight. African Americans did involve themselves in the Civil War. In the South, towards the end, they were so desperate for soldiers that they actually promised slaves their freedom if they fought on their side and the South won. On the Northern side, in 1861, they passed the Confiscation Act, which authorized Union soldiers to seize property used to support the rebellion, and that specific property would be slaves. And they called these slaves intelligent contraband. So those that were either confiscated or those that had escaped from the South fled to the North or fled to where the military, Union military, was fighting in the South and joined up. Over 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. Initially, many Northern whites were offended by blacks fighting for the Union. They did not like the idea of a black man fighting in a white man's war. However, many of the black troops and the black battalions are going to change that perspective. The most well-known of these black units is the Massachusetts 54th. This particular group was led by Captain Gould that you see up here. And you might notice he's not black. All of the black units were led by white soldiers because it was not believed that black soldiers had the intelligence or the capacity to be in an officer's position. They were involved in the ill-fated attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. This was absolutely a suicide mission. The men that were going into battle in South Carolina needed a frontal assault. However, this particular assault was going to be going uphill. So you have, and this is my terrible drawing here, but you have up here the Confederacy that has the high ground. The Massachusetts 54th was going to have to run across this open ground and fight their way uphill, which allowed for the Confederacy to just fire upon them, massacring these men. Most of them died within this battle, but it solidified them in history as heroes to the Union cause. This heroism was then recorded down and was made into the fantastic film titled Glory. This movie follows the story of the Massachusetts 54th and their rise to glory. It has some of the most fantastic actors of the day. Matthew Broderick, aka Ferris Bueller, ends up playing our friend here, Captain Gould. You also are going to have Cary Elwes, who is from The Princess Bride, playing his right-hand man. And then you also have Denzel Washington and God himself playing in this movie. It's a fantastic film. I highly recommend that you get a chance to watch it. The Emancipation Proclamation is the reason why the Union's morale changes, partially due to the fact that there were so many of the contraband that were escaping to the Union cause. We needed to officially make them free if they were going to fight with us. And so because of that, Abraham Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation, which immediately calls for the emancipation of all slaves in the states of rebellion. But I'd like for you to pay attention to this. It's the states of rebellion. In other words, he is going to be freeing the slaves in the Confederacy. He specifically does not mention the border states. He does not mention any slaves in the Union. There's a very specific reason for this. He knew that if he freed the slaves in the Union and those border states, that the border states could potentially secede and fight for the South. So he specifically left them out of this. But that means that if he is emancipating the slaves in the states of rebellion, that we are actually trying to make a law in a country other than our own. That would be the same as us trying to tell Canada what their speed limit would be. We don't have the power to do that. And so it didn't actually free a single slave. What it does is it gives the Union a moral cause. They can look in the South as they march through the South, seeing the slaves working on the plantations and in the field, and know that that is what they are fighting for. They are fighting for those people right there. That is a moral cause that they can get behind. It's a lot more tangible than the idea of preserving the Union. This is something physical that they can put their lives behind. And so we hit the peak and end of the war. The siege of Vicksburg is one of the saddest events within the Civil War. The civilians of Vicksburg lived through a 47-day-long siege under the Union, under the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant. Continually for 47 days, bombs and bullets and cannon fire was going off and destroying the entire town of Vicksburg. Families were having their homes destroyed and had to live, and as you can kind of see in the picture here, these ramshackle lean-tos, and even were living in caves and trenches to escape the bombardment. Many people were starving in the process. They ran out of food, and they went to eventually eating their pets as well as eating the rats that they found in the trenches that they were living in. Many civilians were suffering from shell shock as a result of the constant bombardment, and because of this, the city of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July for nearly 100 years after the end of the Civil War, because they had such strong, angry feelings of resentment as a result of the siege. But what this did for the North was it gave the North a new person to look to as leadership, Ulysses S. Grant. The Battle of Gettysburg is considered to be the turning point in the war in favor of the North, and it is the bloodiest overall battle of the Civil War. It was a 3-day-long battle that left thousands and thousands dead. After Confederate attacks on both Union flanks had failed the day and the night before, Robert E. Lee was determined to strike the Union center on the 3rd day. With approximately 1,200 men and 9 infantry brigades, they advanced over open fields for 3/4 of a mile under heavy Union artillery and rifle fire. They literally were trying to run the gauntlet, and this is known as Pickett's Charge. It was an absolute disaster. They could not maintain their hold, and over 50% of their men died in that particular charge. All in all, at the Battle of Gettysburg, there were over 51,000 casualties, over 8,000 dead, 30,000 wounded, and over 10,000 captured or missing. A few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln would be asked to come to the dedication ceremony. He was not the main speaker. He was actually almost invited as an afterthought. The main speaker was the great orator of his day and spoke for nearly 2 hours on the war and the beliefs of the Union in the war. Afterwards, Abraham Lincoln got up and gave a speech that lasted not even 2 full minutes. By Senator Charles Sumner at Abraham Lincoln's funeral, he said, "In the modesty of Lincoln's nature, he said, 'The world will little note nor long remember what we say here.' He was mistaken. The world noted at once what he said and will never cease to remember it. The battle itself was less important than the speech." Sumner was right. The Gettysburg Address is probably more important than the actual battle itself, because the speech was where Abraham Lincoln was able to explain in extremely plain terms the purpose of the war and his goals for bringing the country back together when it was finished.
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
It wasn't long after the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg that Abraham Lincoln's attention was caught by Ulysses S. Grant. He had gained a lot of recognition for his successes in the Western Campaign in the Siege of Vicksburg. The Wilderness Campaign, although usually described as a draw, was a strategic victory for the Union Army. Although the North suffered very large casualties, they were smaller than the percentage of casualties suffered by the South. And so overall, it was seen as a victory. And because of Grant's ability to win at all costs and his willingness to fight to the death, is the reason why Abraham Lincoln promoted him to commanding general of the United States Army in 1864. And he would continue to lead the Army throughout the remainder of the war and be the one to accept Lee's surrender in 1865. The reason why Grant was so desirable for Lincoln is because Grant was willing to fight a war of attrition. A war of attrition is a battle strategy in which one side attempts to win a war by wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous losses in soldiers and materials. In other words, you continually fight and fight and fight and fight until your enemy can no longer fight. It's often won by the side that has the greater resources, the one that has more men to lose, more materials to lose. And considering that at the outset of the war, the North had control of 3/4 of all industry and all railroads, plus 2 times as many men as the South, they have more men to lose, they have more materials that they can lose, and it still is less than the overall percentage lost by the South. A perfect example of this war of attrition is Sherman's March to the Sea. William Tecumseh Sherman was one of Ulysses S. Grant's right-hand men, and the March to the Sea was the campaign to conquer Georgia. As he went through Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman and his men destroyed military and civilian targets and operated under the scorched earth system, where they would burn everything behind them so that the Confederate soldiers as well as the Confederate civilians would not be able to utilize them. As he said, "The entire South, man, woman, and child, is against us. We are not fighting just an army, but a whole people. We must make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war. The more awful we make the war, the sooner it will end. Now, what you see in the picture down at the bottom here are some of Tecumseh's men creating what were known as Sherman's neckties. What they did is they pulled up the railroad ties from the few railroads that existed in the South. They heated them up and then they bent them around trees. What this did is it made it absolutely impossible for the South to get those straightened out to be used again as railroad ties, so effectively destroying transportation in the South. While on his march to the sea, Sherman also issued Special Field Orders Number 15. This would divide confiscated Confederate land to be settled by freed slave families. And this led to a phrase that was commonly used at the time, that the North promised 40 acres and a mule to all freed slaves. While this was not necessarily 100% accurate, the idea was that all those large plantations would be divided up for the newly freed slaves to be able to occupy, to farm on, and to be able to make their way and their lives in. However, despite the victories that were now coming on the Union side, it did not mean that there was not conflict. In fact, there was a lot of conflict in politics. In the government that Lincoln was trying to run, there was a lot of division, especially over issues concerning the war. The Radical Republicans were a group of abolitionists who were demanding harsh penalties for the Confederacy as a result of their seceding from the Union. They felt that they needed to be punished. This group was going to be led by quite a few men. It's going to be led by our old friend Charles Sumner, as well as John C. Fremont, but the one that is going to become kind of the leader of it is Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens is going to be kind of the main guy for this particular grouping. The radicals butted heads with moderates like Abraham Lincoln, who, although the South had seceded, they felt that there should be some kind of reunification, some benefit of the doubt, considering that they were Americans. Then you're going to have the Democrats. And the Democrats in the North are severely divided at this time. You have the war Democrats, who support Lincoln and support the war. Then you have the moderates, who didn't fully support Lincoln and didn't fully support the war itself either. And then you have the Copperheads, these radical peace Democrats, as you see in the image here. They are designed to have a name similar to the copperhead snake. They are seen as dangerous. They are seen as poisonous to the American system. The reason that they were seen so dangerous is because of their strong opposition to the war. They blamed abolitionists for starting the war. These people resisted draft laws, persuaded Union soldiers to desert the war. They also helped Confederate soldiers escape Union prisons. They saw Lincoln as a tyrannical dictator and did whatever they could to subvert the war's success. This is going to have a large impact on the upcoming election in 1864, largely because of the divisions. It is going to have a impact on who is going to win. When we see the Republicans divided into not one but two groups, it does cause some concern because you know that division is going to make them weaker. However, the Democrats are split into 1, 2, 3 groups, and that makes them extremely weak in comparison to the Republicans. But Lincoln came up with a brilliant plan. In the election of 1864, Lincoln decides that instead of dividing the nation, he was going to try and bring it back together again. And he helps create the National Union Party. Republicans and war Democrats united for the election of 1864 to create a temporary political party. This political party was going to have Abraham Lincoln as the presidential candidate and a Southern Democrat, Andrew Johnson, the one Southern Democrat that did not walk out of Congress when the South seceded. He was going to be the vice presidential candidate. This was going to bring the two political parties together, and they would win in a landslide. Only about a month after Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln take office, the war would officially end. April 9th, 1865, Ulysses S. Grant would take the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. And although the war had ended, it did not mean that the feelings of division were now gone. In fact, they were very much alive. The Civil War has the highest number of American deaths in our history, more than almost all others combined. And it is this incredibly high number of deaths that has been the reason for the division between the North and South that still kind of exists today, that there are still feelings of resentment and anger between the two sides for the deaths of all of these young men. If you have any questions about these topics or anything that has been discussed in this video today, please make sure to write them down so you can ask them when I return from my vacation. And I hope that you guys will rewatch this video if you have any notes that you didn't get a chance to take. It will be posted up on our class website for your convenience.